Howdy, folks, and welcome back to another episode of Follow the Leader. I'm your host, Lee Larson here. And, folks, I have brought the outdoors to your screen here with Land Tawney, the co chair of American Hunters and Anglers. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Lee.
Oh, Land, you are a fifth generation Montanan, and when I tell you folks, his resume, he's come stacked. He got his wildlife biology BA back from University of Montana in 2000 and has since worked for a number of different organizations, really focusing on conservation, public lands, and of course now we're here with American Hunters and Anglers. Tell us, Land, just what an impressive resume. You're from Montana. Were
Yeah.
you was that part of your childhood and upbringing? Was the lands? And talk to us about that.
Yeah, totally. Thank you, Lee. Impressive, I don't know, but, as a kid, I was lucky enough, to grow up here in Montana, had parents that got me out in the woods and on the water. It's, like, super early, so I'm here in my office, I got a picture of, my dad with me on his back, fishing the Big Hole River here in Montana, and I'm, like, 2 years old, I think. I elk hunted with him before I could hardly even hike up the mountains. I wasn't even carrying a rifle, and I had to step in every single one of his footsteps. Um, and so they immersed me in the outdoors. And so I think there's that first kind of just love of just everything that, hunting, fishing, kayaking, canoeing, mountain biking, just anything that's outdoors, I love to do. And then my parents were super involved in conservation. And so they were the first full-time conservation lobbyists at the state legislature here in Montana. My dad was the first lawyer for the Elk Foundation, which is based here in Missoula, where I'm at. And, I'd go to these meetings and I don't think I was paying attention that much, Lee. Like I was more by osmosis at that point. But then my dad passed away when I was 19, which was a huge event in my life. And, I like at that point, I kind of was like, ooh, this conservation thing, it kind of grabbed me. And so I've been working in conservation since and, got that wildlife biology degree and wish I was out in the woods sometimes and doing the wildlife biology, but it was more like a background for my policy work. And so it's working with volunteers, grassroots kind of organizing, and then working on, federal and state policy. So it's been a lot of fun. I'm dating myself, but I've been doing it for 25 years now, so which kind of scares me at some level. But yeah, that's a little bit of the background. But it really started, in the streams in the mountains of Montana.
Oh, and that's exactly, I mean, when you talk about growing up in Montana, I know a lot of folks have that river runs through it, Brad Pitt visualization, and it was real for you. Like that was your reality. And it's exactly what paved the way for you to take on these conservation efforts. My condolences about the loss of your father. I apologize. I'm
Thank you.
sorry to hear that.
Yeah, thank you.
I am Yes, I wanted to talk about your Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership real quick because what it looks like is that got to show you, it took you out of Montana to a couple of different states. Did you see, as you said, your conservation sort of informs your policy work. Do you see policies across state lines that can be adopted easily, or particularly as you're running around, it looks like Montana, Idaho, and the Dakotas? What does conservation policy look like for this region with those states?
Yeah, so I think, with the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, I started as a volunteer, which I would tell anybody that's listening to this, like volunteerism is one of the greatest ways to get into conservation, right? Like, and whether that's with a local rod and gun club, with an organization, whatever. But then I worked into a full-time job with them, and one of the things that we worked on, policy-wise, was a thing called open fields, and this was through the Farm Bill, which gets kinda nerdy pretty quick. But what it did is it provided money to farmers and ranchers to open up their land to public hunting, right? So it was private land for public hunters. So here in Montana, we have the block management program. It's 8 million acres of private land that is accessible to the public to hunt and to fish. And it's administered by Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And so it's the most successful program in the country, but there's other states that hadn't necessarily started their programs yet or needed a little influx of cash. And so that program is still alive and well today. I think it got passed maybe back in 2003 or so for the first time. But that was one of these issues. And I think about policy, right? You can work on, uh, you can work on block management here in Montana, but that only affects Montana. When you work on a policy at a federal level, then it starts to have impacts on other states. And so, I've hunted in North Dakota and South Dakota and Idaho on pieces of property that are part of their public access or private land programs. They're all called something different. They're not called the block management program, which is kind of a beautiful thing, I guess, in some ways, because then the states can kind of do it how they want and how what's conducive to their state, where, and they can kind of tailor make it to their state. So, yeah, that's one example I would say of just that work that, you do stuff at a federal level and has implications, in many different places on the ground.
Well, because after you did your, work for, it looks like the National Wildlife Federation covering those states after the
Yeah,
Theodore Roosevelt, um, looks like you went and professionally went in, as you mentioned earlier, you're a big hunter and, you worked on the national sportsman campaigns. Talk about that relationship between public lands and and sportsmen, as particularly, for some folks who may not even be familiar with how hunting may work with conservation.
totally. So I think like the first thing I would say is that the United States of America is different than any other country in the world, where we have the public wildlife belong to the people, and that happened with this Supreme Court case way back in 1842. It was about oysters, and this oysterman was taking oysters out of the water. This private landowner was like, "You cannot have that. I own the water." And ultimately, the Supreme Court decided that those oysters belong to the people, and he had the rightful opportunity to take them. And so that's where kind of wildlife was established that it belonged to the people. Where let's say in Europe, it's the king's game they call it, right? And so it's the rich and the wealthy and the nobles that actually own that still to this day, and that you have to pay some sort of fee to even harvest one of those animals. So that's the first piece, wildlife, and then the second piece would be that public lands belong to the people too. And so, little history there is that, back in the, I would say, early 1900s, Theodore Roosevelt decided that, he wanted to make sure that these American lands stayed public. And so he started creating the first national wildlife refuge, the first national monument, first reserves. And so this public land could be used for the people. And he kind of coined the word conservation. So for the most people, the best use for the most amount of time. And so when he did that, he kind of started this legacy, and he set aside 240 million acres. That has grown to 640 million acres that you and I, anybody listening to this, owns. And so again, that's unique in the world. Canada, has some crown lands, is what they call them, which has some similar things. A lot of water in the world you can actually access, but land is kind of hard to come by, especially for hunting and fishing. And so I think like that history is important. And then you ask the question about kind of, hunters' role, anglers' role in kind of conservation. And I talked about Roosevelt. You go into this time, like let's say like when the Dust Bowl is happening, and you have the lids coming off the prairie, and there's all sorts of problems with wildlife. It's bad for people. And hunters decided they were going to tax themselves. And so what we did is we said on any kind of ammunition or guns that we buy, we're going to tax ourselves. And it was actually a pretty large tax. It's ranges from 10 to 12%. That goes back into a fund called the Sports Fish and Restoration Fund. Then that gets distributed to the states. And so then the states can use that fund for managing wildlife. They can use that for hunter education, and they can use that for shooting ranges, which is kind of part of that hunter education. And so that idea of kind of giving back from hunters is just it's a huge piece that that we do every single time anytime we purchase, still to this day. It generates about $1 billion a year, which is like pretty awesome. So it's giving back, Lee. And then I think that hunters in general have been a part of just conservation in this country. You go to the 60s, rivers are on fire, and literally on fire. That's when the Clean Air and the Clean Water Acts are written. That's when the Wilderness Act passes, and hunters were right behind that kind of piece. And today, I would say that that hunters are still in the middle of almost every single conservation fight in this country, and they're doing it because they there's probably nobody that has more of an intimate relationship with those kind of, you know, the wildlife and then the public lands because they spend so much time out there, right? And then we're participants versus observers. Yeah, hunters been a part of like the conservation story for a long time in this country, and they will continue to be.
Absolutely. And for my listeners, a few months ago, I went to the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center. It's associated with our state parks, and it's all about, of course, Lewis and Clark history. And they always have speakers. A game warden came and, of course, talked about all the different things he's seen. And he's specific. And for folks, game wardens are trained like police and sheriffs because they actively have to they might be in situations where they're interacting with someone with a gun that's illegally hunting or trespassing or just something. I had no idea the training they had, and, but that's exactly it, like, most of our, conservation or hunting laws, rules are set by hunters themselves, and a lot of self-policing and a lot of caring about the territories that they have protected, um, and I think that gets really misconstrued, especially when you have certain groups promoting, yeah, this the worst possible caricature of people and guns and wildlife, and like you said, it's in the fiber of particularly out here in the West, but just in
Uh,
America.
I mean, those game wardens, shout out to those game wardens, right? You know, they're kind of like on the front lines of conservation. And like you said, they're dealing with people that have guns pretty much all the time, right? And so they have to have training. And I think, like, you reminded me, the first game laws in Montana came into place in 1872. And what was happening is like you had like these mining camps and they were dynamiting rivers to feed these mining camps, right? Because you know, catching a bunch of fish would have taken forever, but if you dynamite the river, all these fish float to the top, and so this was having huge implications, you know, for the fishing, for like the fish populations, and so that's what our first game law was like. You can't dynamite anymore. You can only use like, oh, it was, I think it was like hook and line. I think was the actual words. You can only use hook and line to catch fish, and so like again, the game warden's gotta deal with that, like somebody dynamiting, you know, like whatever river, and so it's pretty rad that you got to, like, hear from one because they are on the front lines of conservation.
And I had no idea. You just think I think I don't know what I thought going into that lecture, but I audibly yelled like, "What? Like, you do that?" I didn't like, I was, like, looking around, I was like, "I didn't realize they're kinda badass guys." And, like, I like but, yeah, they absolutely are, and, because it's dangerous. First of all, you got wildlife, just
Totally.
the nature that you're going out there, and then, of course, you got folks and, with firearms, but yeah, all of that is, it's deeply cared about and it's nuanced. And I think that's what we want to drill home today is this history of conservation is largely led by hunters and anglers and not just to say this, it's not just tree hugging hippies, right? Like it's there's real relationship here, and I'm so glad that even when I moved to Montana, coming from Texas, like there's so many similarities, but I noticed that things like social issues that could have gotten you into a bar fight in Texas didn't get you into those fights here in Montana, but a land comment could. Not necessarily Land Tawney, but if you said something like you could get in a bar fight over land in a heartbeat in Montana. And I just was like, oh, we're having fun now. So thank you.
Welcome to Montana, right?
Welcome.
Where even the hippies hunt and fish, right? Like, I think would be,
Yeah.
like, what I would say. Yeah.
Right! Like, yeah, yeah, it's funny that I've so many women have either firearm training, hunters like, some background that's some like, it's a
It's the most
whole it's a
organic way to get food, right? Like, it's the most organic
right.
way to get food, and so, you know, at least protein, right? And so, you know, I mean, I think, like, people sometimes look down on hunters because we do kill animals, right? And I think that's a tough part of hunting, especially big game. I think, you know, waterfowl and upland birds don't have the same effect on me, but I think big game does, and, you know, it's tough to take a life, but then it's awesome to feed your family, and, I mean, we just had some deer on Sunday night that was like the shank, so that bone is kinda like the ankle bone, and man, it was delicious, delicious.
And even if you're not like hunting or, your own meal, going and supporting local, the whole industry, it's so easy
Totally, totally,
to do that, and the network, you know that you're eating directly from the land, local land, like, the guy who killed there's an element that's also super humane and natural that I think a lot of folks don't understand, and I even say this when we talked about environmental stuff before this, but I'll start looking at, like, corporate farming and that and how
totally,
much better I feel as a human going with a local family farm, because of it's just like you said, the taking of a life, is something very delicate, something that, you, take seriously while also recognizing that the whole process, is just a natural, humane way of living that we've done for thousands of years.
totally.
Um, is there a particular, when you look at the Montana landscape, what are some pressing issues that you're really kind of concerned in the next year or so?
Great question. So, I mean, I think I would talk about kind of federal policy because that's what I'm working on most, but how it affects Montana. And so, here in this state, we have a ton of public lands. I think 35% of the state is public, right? And so I talked about the 8 million acres that is private that's open to, public hunting. I've grown up here, and so I know quite a few ranchers that I can go, hunt on their place, and you can even still, knock on doors that aren't part of that program. But that 35% that is public is open to everybody, right? And it's these opportunities to hunt and fish. And so one of the areas that has a designation on Forest Service lands, it's called roadless areas. And these roadless areas were established like back in, I think around 2000. And really, these are kind of the wildest of, like I would say, besides wilderness, which there's a lot of wilderness in Montana too. But besides these roadless lands, there's really nothing more, I think, wild had roads punched into them, right? Because it was hard to get in there because they're steep. It's not they didn't have as marketable timber a lot of times, and so these lands have kind of been this area for hunters in particular. Like roadless lands are some of the best places to go hunt elk. Like, elk love to be at least a mile away from a road, so roadless lands, like, when they provide security basically for these elk, I think so when you think roadless, think elk habitat, and they're also, I would say, filters for our cold water streams, which are super important to our trout, cutthroat trout, our native trout in particular. And so these lands, they've been roadless since 2000. The last thing I guess I would say is that we don't have enough money right now to manage the existing road network that we have on our Forest Service lands. And so I give you all that background as there's some a movement afoot by this administration to really just undo the roadless rule. And are there some roadless lands that probably don't deserve roadless protection anymore? I would probably say yes, right? And like we can rethink those things. But the idea to just throw it out all at one time just doesn't make much sense. And so that's going on right now. There was a comment period for the Forest Service. Forest Service is looking at those comments right now. Sounds like sometime in like March or April, they're going to come out with their preferred alternative, which will, who knows what that's going to be. That will provide another opportunity for the public to get engaged, provide comments there. But, I think, again, the big ones are roadless lands equal elk habitat and they equal, filters for our cold water streams that are important to trout. And so we hope that the administration listens to the people. I think, it's overwhelmingly supported by the people of Montana in particular. So that's a big one, I would say, that's facing us here in this state. Um, I guess maybe one more that, and then you can ask me other questions, but like, this last fall, right, or last spring, like a bunch of our public land managers, the people, again, like you talked about the wardens, they work for the state, right? They work for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks here in Montana. But then you have the people that are like the biologists and the people that are working on road maintenance, the people that are working on timber harvest. Those are the people that work for like the Forest Service. Then you have people that work for like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which would be like all the refuges. So that's like Lee Metcalf, which is south of me, which is a pretty small refuge, all the way to the Charles M. National Wildlife Refuge, which is smack dab in the middle of the state. It's just south of Lewistown. That's 1.1 million acres, right? And so that's like habitat for pronghorn and mule deer, for elk. They've got sage grouse there. They've got sharp-tailed grouse there. It's an amazing, amazing place that actually Lewis and Clark came through, and it pretty much it's like it was when they went through, besides the big old dam on the river. But so all these people that are on the front lines, they were, they were let go from their jobs. A lot of them last February. And so these are agencies that, were already kind of understaffed and underfunded, and now they're operating at the very minimum a 25% less workforce. And so what that means is like it's not as much things can get done, right? And so that's habitat improvement, again, maintenance, looking at timber sales. And so it's something for people to be aware of. And when they have the opportunity to talk to our elected officials, is really asking them how can we get up, to the levels that before kind of Elon Musk took a chainsaw to the workforce, but even increase those levels, and so that we can get the most out of our public lands, right? I mean, it's such a economic driver in this state. I think that access piece. I don't know if you think of, I mean, Texas, where you came from, right? Like has one of the smallest percentages of public land in the country, and tons of hunting and fishing that still goes on there. They actually have a great stream access law, but like the public land here drives our outdoor economy, and that outdoor economy is sustainable, and it's something that we can grow as long as we're caring and feeding these public lands that give us so much. So that kind of the infrastructure, which is not super sexy at all, Lee. Like, nobody really wants to talk about like more people and more money, but it's the way we get stuff done on the ground. So those are two that I would give you, at least from the start.
Well, going back to this administration, like you said, there was some conversation about what to do because Montana, the state, cannot afford to maintain its roads. Recently, I had another Montana official on here said that they would prefer that the land stay with the country, the feds, because the states are going to sell it off. Is am I hearing that or okay?
Yeah, I mean, I'd give you and I talk about this a lot. So it's like I've come up with this three Ds, right? So what they're doing is they're defunding, and that's what I was kind of just talking about. Then they're dismantling, right? So like you're dismantling like the workforce, you're dismantling the actual. I talked about the roadless, like you get rid of the roadless lands. That's kind of dismantling that great protection. And then ultimately, you're trying to divest, which is just a fancy word for like sell it off, right? So defund, dismantle, divest. And so there's some people, I mean, my family, I'm a fifth generation. My family first came here, in the 1870s, but they didn't have a ranch. Like, we were mortuars. And so like, we had a funeral home, and we dealt with death all the time. And so I don't have a big ranch, I don't have a farm. And so sure, if I could get some cheap land, that'd be rad. But this 35% that belongs to you and I and everybody listen to this, that is so valuable staying in public hands. And so there's these folks on the outside that are, I would say working to, again, those three Ds so that ultimately they can buy, little slices of heaven. Since you've been here, how long have you been here?
Roughly 4 years.
So 4 years, right? And so like the state is changing in a lot of ways, right? And there's a lot of people moving in, which is awesome. They're moving in because of the opportunities that we have here, but we have to maintain those things. And if they're transferred to the states can't afford them, whether that's road maintenance, they couldn't afford one fire year, and they would have to start selling these lands. The state of Montana has done that in the past, and they'd have to do it again. And so, it's something to pay attention to. And I think the states and the feds can work, better together. And I've been a part of some of those conversations and actually working on the ground to do that. But ultimately, I think keeping them in, I would say, federal management because they actually belong to us, the people, right? And I think that's an important distinction.
Absolutely, and thank you for clarifying all of that. The 35% of public land, 35% of Montana being public lands. Yeah, I mean, it's significant. I read once that, like, I mean, it's such a core part. When I first moved to Montana, one of the first things that locals encouraged me to do was to get involved in some way with a statewide organization called Wild Montana because they had grizzly bear talks. They had hikes, like guided hikes in the week. Like there was it. I can't explain to anyone who's not from here how culturally, intertwined the outdoors are in pushing people to start getting educated about them, start getting safe, um, because it's not Colorado. I don't I'm sorry, but there's just, there's a lot of other things that in a sparse population and lots of outdoor land that you need to, A, be aware of and to learn about. This entire story of you growing up along the river or outside, with all these people moving here, they might not have that same value. They might be coming from these major cities and see it as like, oh, yeah, that's great there, and just not treasure it the same way. And like you said, when, outside forces, whether it's folks coming in who don't understand, new residents, or at the top, the administrative bureaucratic level, y you've got your hands full. I did wanna circle back though, about particularly this administration and well, it could be federal or state, but really looking at Ryan Zinke's role as chair of the Public Lands Caucus in the House. What are some concerns and what are some hopes of what he does with that role?
It's great. Thank you, Lee. And I'll do that in 1 second. But these public lands and the public waters are like our big backyard, right? Like, again, like you and I live like royalty because we have this 35% that we can go and we really don't have to ask. I mean, there's certain things that, sometimes you have to have to permission depending on like who's the land manager. National park, you can't do anything you want. But on Forest Service land, on Bureau of Land Management land, I mean, it's like, it's our kingdom and it's pretty rad. So, Mr. Zinke. So I've known Congressman Zinke for a long time since he was at the state legislature here in Montana, and when he went to Congress and then became Secretary of Interior, and now he's back in Congress. And so first I'll start with some awesomeness with him that there was this bill proposed in the House by this woman Celeste Malloy. She's out of Utah to sell 3 million acres of our public land. So she wanted to get rid of 3 million acres and just in one fell swoop. And this was a bill in the House of Representatives out in DC. Congressman Zinke really led an effort in the House to get that taken out of a larger bill that was placed into, and he deserves a ton of credit for that. That 3 million acres, one, that's a big chunk of property, but it also, if you do it, then it just opens up the door for more, right? And so I think his leadership there is much appreciated. After that kind of happened, along with a congressman from New Mexico, whose name is Gabe Vasquez, they got together and they formed this Public Lands Caucus. And really, with the idea that they wanted to kind of promote public lands, they want to stop these sales. But if that's like our low bar, right? Like, like if we're only preventing the sale of public lands, man, we got to be doing more than that, right? We got to make sure that we have the quality habitat when we get there, and opportunities to hunt and fish and go recreate, like we've been talking about. And so, we had a lot of hope, I think, for this caucus, and still have a lot of hope for this caucus. What I will say is that just recently, there was an issue in northern Minnesota. So there's this mine there, and it's called the Boundary Waters. Or excuse me, I'll step back. The mine is not called the Boundary Waters. There's this place called the Boundary Waters. It's like 1.1 million acres. I've been there 4 times. It's like lakes upon lakes. Like, think about Minnesota, and it's basically you get in a canoe, you put all your stuff for like the week in your canoe, and you go from lake to lake to lake, and it is absolutely awesome. And it's the most visited wilderness in the country because a grandma that's 98 and a little kid can get in that canoe, and sure, they got to go up and over these like portages, but there's hardly any elevation, so it's super accessible. You can hunt and fish there. But there's a mine that's proposed a quarter mile south, and this mine, it's owned by a Chilean billionaire, and the ore would be shipped to China, and then we'd have to buy it back. And it's like there couldn't be a worse like kind of proposal, and it's just right on the edge of the Boundary Waters, and all this water is on the Rainy River watershed. All that water kind of flows north into the Boundary Waters, and it's just a bad place for a mine. We had great hopes that this Public Lands Caucus would say this is a bad idea. Ultimately, this provision passed the House by 6 votes. In the Public Lands Caucus, not only did none of all the Democrats in the Public Land Caucus voted against this proposal, and all the Republicans voted for it. And not only did all the Republicans vote for it, but Zinke was out there telling everybody that this was a great idea. And so this is like literally, it's not some random wilderness. This is the most visited wilderness in the country. And so that's a piece of public land that I'm super disappointed with this vote on. And I think, that that has implications here in Montana for, any kind of wilderness that potentially has a mine on the edge of it. And, we've had some conversations with him about this. And I think that, his ideas that this mining plan, there won't be any problems with it. It's a copper nickel mine. In the history of the world, like entire world, there's never been a copper nickel mine that hasn't leached like toxic sludge. And so it's like, okay, that's what the mining company is saying it'll never happen, but are we willing to risk this really special place, you know, for again, a foreign owned like a copper nickel mine that the ore is going to go to China? Like that just makes zero sense. And so that's a big one that we're real disappointed with him on. I'm real disappointed in that caucus. I think one that's coming up, it's outside of Montana, but it's going to happen here in the next couple of weeks, is that there's a national monument down in Utah. It's called Staircase Escalante. It's absolutely amazing. There's desert bighorn sheep there. There's elk. There's pronghorn. There's mule deer. It is as and just like the geography of it, like there's big red rocks, right? Like I mean, there's a bunch of archaeological like sites from Native Americans. There's a bill that's gonna go in to try to take away that status for the national monument so they can go put a coal mine in there, which right now we don't need that coal, and again, that coal would be shipped to China, which makes no sense, it's just making people money, and so there's this opportunity, okay, they didn't get it done on the Boundary Waters, but they have this chance to do it for the Staircase Escalante, and so there is some hope there, I would say, and I think that, the way politics works is that when somebody makes a bad decision, you let them know, and then it's okay for them then to learn from that, right? And I think this was a teaching moment, hopefully for Mr. Zinke and others on that Public Lands Caucus, that we expected something different from them. And those are just two I brought out. I think there's other issues that are happening up in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, up in Alaska. Talked about these roadless lands, like they could be leading on the roadless piece. And so there's other issues, but that's one that's going to be coming down the pike like very quickly.
I'm glad you brought that up. About the boundary waters, and the mining, because of course Montanans are very sensitive to mining monopolies, and just uh, for those who aren't too familiar, Montana had its fair share. We had it's called the Copper Kings, and they basically not only did whatever they wanted, but one of them controlled the media too. So it's a whole ugly story, or the newspaper or something. But but yeah, we get real sensitive about mining operations. We have some super fun sites. I know here in Great Falls, down in Butte. And then I had the opportunity this past spring to go to Appalachia. And because a big concern over there is the mountaintop removal valley fill, how there's a and before I ask you my question, I'll briefly explain it. But folks, the technology for mining is totally different than how you imagine it, back in the 1800s. And what they are doing now is just literally dynamite and blowing up the tops of mountains, and then bringing in like massive construction. Cranes is not the word, but these type of machines. And what's really hard about it too is there's not it's not even like labor intensive, so you can't hire a bunch of people in the community. And so that used to be the case, is we need to hire all these people, and but now so many of them are machine or computer, and folks are having it's exactly what happens when you blow up a mountain. Like things get in the water, things get in the ground table. It's wildlife, people, air. I mean, so can you talk about have you seen any sort of mountaintop removal valley fill, these exploding mountains? Have you heard about any of that coming to Montana, or what does mining look like with Montanans?
No, I haven't. I haven't. I've seen it in Pennsylvania, right? Like I've seen it, and I've been to West Virginia and seen it there too. It is pretty crazy. But I haven't heard about that mountaintop removal kind of stuff coming here. I mean, you bring up the Copper Kings, right? We have the number one Superfund site, in Butte, which is the Berkeley Pit, and then that goes down the Clark Fork, and then ultimately, to Missoula, where I live. So it's like hundreds of miles, and they're still working on cleaning that up, and that happened in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And by the way, awesome that you know this history. Like, you've only been here for 4 years and you know about the Copper Kings. Like, that is super rad.
I go to
That's
lectures around
super rad.
town all the time.
I love it. I love it. Like, you're a student of history, which I think is important, right? Being a student of history, like, you hopefully don't repeat the problems of the past, right? And so, like, there's a current mine that's down the Bitterroot, which is south of me. It's been proposed, and it's in a place called Sheep Creek, which is super sensitive. That's actually a roadless area, they would be punching roads into and then create this mine. And the town of Hamilton, absolutely went nuts, and this is a very, very conservative town in Montana. They had a town hall meeting about it. I think, like, 1,500 people showed up, and so, our delegation, so Congressman Zinke and Senator Dane, Senator Sheehy, they wrote a letter now to the Forest Service saying, "Hey, we don't want you to fast track this mine. We want you to, do the appropriate, I guess, is on if this mine can be viable." But that community does not want it. And part of the reason they don't want it is it's in an amazing elk hunting place. And also the Bitterroot River is, like, hands down one of the best places in the world to fish big brown trout. And it's also a great place for cutthroat trout. And so this is a very, very important place. And again, like, we haven't learned from our past, right? And so people are rightfully so mad about it, and they're using their voice. And at this point, they've been able to at least postpone this mine.
Well, and speaking of learning from history, and also the way you answered the question about Zinke earlier kind of brought to mind how nuance and how we love to make folks heroes and villains. And like one thing is particularly with like Teddy Roosevelt, like he is a hero for conservation, but then he's a villain in other ways. That like, and it's funny because there's things even about this federal administration that they have used Teddy Roosevelt and quoted him, and I was like, "You literally just fired the national park, so that was like his baby. Like, how can
Totally.
you do that?" But can you share with us a little bit about the role of Montana, um, particularly wildfire fighting, if you can, and the National Park Service? I know that's a big question that we could spend a whole pod you could write books on that. But, can you tell us a little bit about the National Park Service in Montana, and that relationship and Teddy Roosevelt for that matter, this whole region?
Yeah, so, like, Yellowstone National Park, I think, was established I keep on saying 1872. It was a big year, right? So that was when the first game laws got put in place, but it was also when they established the, Yellowstone National Park. So first national park established, and that was before Theodore Roosevelt became president, but he definitely visited the park, and it was an inspiration to him. But I think that you think about, like, the birthplace of conservation and the birthplace of trying to protect the things that are most special to us and providing opportunities for future generations. That really started with, the Yellowstone National Park. And then, of course, we have Glacier National Park, which, is north of me. And, I'm remiss that I haven't spent more time there. My mom actually, speaking of writing books, shout out to my mom. She wrote a book called Hiking with Kids in Yellowstone. And I spent 10 days in Yellowstone with my mom when I was like 10 years old. And I've spent a lot more time there since then. But it was like such we were talking about earlier, and I just remembered it. But like these experiences that kind of mold you. That one with my mom, right? Like, we were just traipsing around. So that was awesome. But no, the national parks, they provide, again, a sustainable economy. They provide an opportunity for people to, be awed by nature and inspired and then wanting to do more things for conservation, whether that's them personally or trying to influence others on policy. And so they play a huge role in this state. And I think, you know, the state of Montana is kinda like the birthplace, I would say, of conservation in a lot of ways because of the national park, because of the game laws that we did a long time ago. You talk about firefighting, like here in Missoula, Neptune Aviation, which fights fires all over the country. It's based here in Missoula and has been for a long time, where they were taking, old, airplanes and retrofitting them and help, having them, help fight fires. And so, that idea of, being part of that landscape has been something that's just kind of always been in Montana and part of our fabric of who we are. And I think I'm not gonna say that there's not other states that have that. There definitely is. But here it just feels different, and I think people from outside the state, but also people inside the state recognize that, and it's because I think it's just been a part of who we are for so long, and, so yeah, the firefighting, the firefighting's an interesting one. This last summer, we didn't have smoke seasonally, like usually, like from like even June all the way through August, like we have this smoke, right? That starts from up in Canada or we get it from Washington. We didn't really have any fires last year. And it was like amazing, right? Like amazing. That was anomaly, right? Like this, it's going to happen again. There's going to be more fires. And partly that's because we haven't let fires, burn. It's partly because we haven't done enough, I would say, timber harvest and that kind of urban wildland interface. But, that the firefighters are super important to help save, I would say, people's houses, but also infrastructure. When you think about, the power lines or or whatever kind of, energy distribution that's happening in this state, like firefighters are helping protect those things so that we all don't go dark either. So no, it's super important. And yeah, I don't know. Montana, thank goodness.
No, it's a really fascinating history just about because this was pristine land. I mean, at one point, my listeners, when the early folks came in here and commodified everything, there were what Stumptown. Was that Whitefish or Missoula where they just hacked the timber and there were no trees for as far as the eye can see. And so this response um, has long been a part of Montanans establishing and reclaiming just being almost like a human. Like we wanted America, we had this whole world, and this we're not gonna let the capitalists just take it and exploit it. I guess is the point is having some conservation, having relationship, having nuance. Um, I do want to ask some folks. You brought up wilderness lands. You've brought up state. I think I brought up state parks, and then you've talked about the different levels of
Yeah,
land protection.
yeah.
So we have national parks and state parks, and then we have national forests. Humans can recreate, there's different rules for both of them, but what does it look like in terms of taking resources from those things? Are some of these places more protected than others? And what does that look like?
Great question. So I would say that national parks, right? Like you can't hunt in national parks. There are some units across the country where you can hunt in them, but those aren't national parks. They're just units that are managed by the national park system. But then, so national parks, I would say that is one of the most protective. But you can have roads through the middle of a national park, right? Like you going to the Sun Road in Glacier Park, or down in Yellowstone. There's roads down there. Um, but you can't hunt in there, and you can't take any kind of resources from there. You can fish, but you can't keep the fish, right? So I've fished a lot. In Yellowstone, and maybe you can, like, I guess they're trying to get rid of lake trout there, so you could probably catch a keep lake trout there. But cutthroats in particular, you can't keep. So that's like a level of protection. Then I would say like wilderness, which is mostly managed by the National Forest System. Wilderness is like you can't have any kind of everything has to be human powered or horse powered really to get in there. So you can't have anything mechanical. That's the right word I was looking for. So you can't have anything mechanical. So what that does is that it prevents, one, road building, it prevents bikes in the wilderness. It prevents it's like supposed to be kind of the wildest of the wild. And this is where they let kind of forest, fires go as long as they're not going to bleed on to other land that could hurt, where we have more infrastructure. But wilderness is probably the most restrictive, but I can hunt there and I can fish there and I can keep that stuff, right? And so
What
it's like,
about
go ahead.
but what for the forest are the is any of those lands commercially available? Like
Good
could
question.
you get timber company come down and knock down national forest land for
So
timber?
so good question. So within the national forest, there's many different designations there too, right? So the national forests manage wilderness, but that wilderness is like the top of kind of the most restrictive, but also kind of some of the best land. And so no, a timber company cannot go into a wilderness and cut down trees. A mining company can't go into a wilderness and do mining. But commercial activities that happen there are outfitting. right? And so that's outfitting for just trips so people can go see it. Like the China Wall and the Bob Marshall is freaking phenomenal. I think it's like 60 miles long of this like rock that goes straight up, and it's like, I mean, it's one of the most iconic things in Montana. So you can either go in there and look at that. You can have an outfitter take you in there, go elk hunting, or you can go fishing. And so that there's that commercial use. But then the Forest Service, then, so they manage that and they manage these roadless lands. We've already kind of talked about that. That's like a step down. You can't have some mechanical use. You can actually have some roads in there. You can do some timber harvest for fire protection. You can fight fires in there. And then you have kind of regular old national forest lands. And these regular old national forest lands, they are they're managed by the Forest Service, but you can do timber harvest there, you can do mining there, you can run cows in there. You can run cows actually in the wilderness, but you can't do it, with you can't take an ATV in there to try to round them up. You have to use horses. But the forest, yes, there's many different designations, which you know, I probably I'm probably not being as succinct as I can, but I think one of the cool things about that is that there's places for everybody, Lee. Like, right? Like, like no matter, and like in regular Forest Service lands, there's a lot more snowmobiling that goes on. There's a lot more mountain biking that goes on. And so like, and I talked about the extraction stuff. And so, there's these public lands, there's different public lands for kind of almost whatever you want to do. And that is like super beautiful. I think some people wish it was all one way or all another, and I don't think that, would work necessarily, and so that's why we have these different designations, and so that's how that's broken down, and I could get real nerdy about, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service lands and Bureau of Land Management, but the Forest Service itself is pretty complicated, but has different designations and for a reason.
Well, and thank you for clarifying all of that because I did see folks who care about lands but maybe don't know the nuance and a lot of people freaking out about national park lands and like those valid. But if lands were going to be sold off and commercialized, there would be other lands before we get to national parks is I think what I'm hearing is
That's
right
fair.
before we get to Yellowstone, they're probably going to go for a forest, but not a wilderness, right? Like so I guess that's what I'm
Totally.
yeah,
Totally.
right.
Totally, and
So
I think that the lands that they were trying to sell, that 3,000,000 acres, was actually Bureau of Land Management, which we haven't even talked about yet. But these Bureau of Land Management lands, there is some here in the West, like up the Blackfoot, just outside of Missoula. There's some recent Bureau of Land Management lands, but most of that is in central Montana and eastern Montana. And they call them kind of like the lonely lands, but they're awesome for pronghorn and mule deer, bird species, etc. But that's the kind of lands that they were talking about selling. I think there's going to be a big push to sell Forest Service lands that are close to population centers, right? And so, you're in Great Falls where, the housing market hasn't gone totally crazy, but in Bozeman and Missoula, it's gone totally crazy, right? And so it's all going to be about affordable housing. And I think, some of us are willing to have that conversation on a very, very small scale, but this is not, an opportunity for people to really go put in, 10 houses that are affordable housing and then another 30 that are super high end condominiums for the super wealthy, right? Like that, like this is our land again. And so I think I think it's important to have that conversation. It's important that people stay engaged, but we have to make sure that the integrity of that being available to the public is maintained.
yeah, absolutely. And folks, I know that you've probably seen the photos and videos of Yellowstone and Glacier and the Bitterroots too. I'm sure, like I said, river runs through it. But eastern Montana is a lot of grasslands and prairie. It's beautiful in its own right, but it's definitely not the scenic Montana that you are probably familiar with. But those lands are actually very critical, particularly the grasslands. And so, it's funny that the boring parts of the earth are actually just so critical when you look at root systems and erosion and wind and all sorts of things. And um, I'm sure you've done quite a bit of work out in eastern Montana. So
Grasslands
I
are the number one threatened landscape in the world, right? And that's for Montana as well. And they have, like you talked about, these gigantic root systems, right? And so they're super important to climate change, like for first, but then also like these prairies that again aren't the super like spectacular vistas. Like, go there in the spring and look at, like, all, like, the flowers and, like, everything's greening up. It is absolutely gorgeous, and it's got its own beauty too, right? And I think that, a lot of that for me comes from the wildlife that is there, and that's the birds and I'd love to see bison, back out on these grasslands in a serious way, and we're trying to do that a little bit in Montana right now, and that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, it absolutely is. Um, so you've talked a lot about hunting, you talked about conservation. For anyone who is like, "You know what? Maybe hunting isn't as bad as I thought it was. I'd like to get into it." Where would someone even start?
That's really great. Um, so I think that, one, if you wanna do it, I think there's plenty of ways to get in, and I think I would tell you a couple. So the first thing is that, Montana has kinda like this network of local rod and gun clubs, right? And so I think it's Russell Country Sportsman actually in Great Falls, and then it's Hellgate Hunters and Anglers here in Missoula, but they're spread out across the state. And they all have kind of like these opportunities to, go learn how to shoot a bow, or, sometimes they'll have, the hardest things is when you kill an animal. Now, what do I do? Right? Like learning how to butcher an animal once you have it on the ground, or field dress it. And so like those local rod and gun clubs, I would point people to like right away, like here in Montana, but that's also across the country. I think, the Montana ethos, there's a lot of them here. The Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, who I used to be the CEO of, right? So there's this Learn to Hunt program that is at Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. That is kind of nationwide. Now it kind of depends on where volunteers are on the ground, or where there's opportunities working with state agencies. But that's another one. So Learn to Hunt. I know that, I've got a friend that I work with doing something else, and they've had, some of these in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They've had some in like San Francisco, California, and so these are happening in urban centers, but also in rural areas. So that's one. But I think, you know, like for folks that are thinking about it, I think there's this thing called the Google machine too, right? And so I think that there's a lot of things to be learned there. And then I think, for the majority, I don't want to speak for all hunters, but I think the majority of hunters are really willing to share kind of some of their knowledge and take somebody under their wing too. And it's a really, really hard, right, to ask somebody. I think it's really hard, especially when we're living, on our phones all the time, right? Like that's like but I think, you're gonna see him at soccer games, you're gonna see him at baseball games, you're gonna see him at sporting event, whatever. Like you're gonna see him at the local farmer's market. Just ask that question about being interested. And as long as you're showing interest and respect, I think that a lot of people are going to be like, yeah, I'll talk to you about this. And, I either tell you more about it, or, potentially they'll even take you out. And I think that, so those three things, I think, local rod and gun clubs. And then I would say, backcountry hunters and anglers learn to hunt program. And then, asking somebody. And if you look up, Ducks Unlimited has like a program, Pheasants Forever. So whatever your kind of species that you're looking for, mule deer, elk foundation, you can get a hold of people and ask those questions.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you brought up the duck hunting as well, because not only are there different options, you don't have to go out and be, going out for the biggest thing. It could start something small, pheasant, duck. Doesn't have to also be graphic. There's a couple of different weapons you can use, firearms you can use. You can also look into archery, which is what I have upstairs. So um, there's so many different ways, that work with you, and just like Leanne said, like, if you're genuine and you're really respectful and you wanna do this, like, people love it. Like, this is our this is our world, so, happy to help, and another thing I wanted to point out too is, with so much about firearms and headlines and our headlines, of course, there's so many ways, gun safety, firearm safety, and a lot of firearm classes that you don't even touch the firearm. Like, you just go in for the class. So again, um, you can tiptoe into this world if you want, or you can dive in. But there's a lot of different entry points, and um, I guess my hope here is that we just learn more and we see how these things are such a vital part to our communities, to our state, to our ecosystem. You start talking about the amount of farming that Montana farmers provide the country. Um, so thank you for being here. For folks that want to support you, how can they follow and how can they donate to the American Hunters and Anglers?
But really the policies that we're working on have so many implications for pretty much every American. So that is just American Hunters Anglers, no and in there. You can go check us out and and follow us along. And we have the vast majority of people that follow us are hunters, but we have a ton of people that don't hunt, and are very thankful for kind of the information that we're giving folks really on a daily basis because there is so much. And this is just an opportunity to kind of break that down in that, minute and a half to like 2 minutes and make it digestible for folks. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any other parting words before we wrap up, Land? I appreciate your time.
Lee, it's gone fast. Probably
It
because I
has
talk
gone
so much.
fast.
I guess the one thing I would say that's kind of been this has been a thread maybe throughout this conversation is that I talked about Theodore Roosevelt, I talked about some of the things during the Dust Bowl, I talked about my parents, and then I talked about what I'm doing now, and I would impart on people that we have these resources and these public lands and these public waters that are such a great legacy, but none of that happened by accident, right? And when I think about, we didn't talk about Native Americans and all and that long kind of 10,000, plus, time in memoriam kind of history around conservation and being stewards of the land. But, the modern day is about 100 and, I mean, like when I say 1872, that's like 150 years ago, right? Like, so it's not that long ago. And we made decisions to get us where we are today. And we're going to have to continue to be involved in conservation, helping make the right choices for we, the public, I would say, to carry on this legacy going into the future. And so that, we have, think altruistically, I think, bringing up Native Americans, they talk about like the 7 generations, right? Think about the three behind you, the one that you have currently, and the next three. And we got to think about that next three, and so that they have kind of some of the same opportunities that we do. And as long as we do that, we'll have clean air, we'll have clean water, we'll have the opportunities to find solace in the woods. We'll be have, to get away from all this craziness, be able to feed our families, get exercise, all those things. But not if we just sit around. Like you have to be engaged. And I think that, this is an important time to do just that.
It absolutely is. Folks, your voice matters. This is your land. These are your lands and your voice, your administration, whether it's local, state, or federal. Like we still have a voice and protect our lands. It's if it's the only earth we got. So
Got it.
thank you, land. Thank you for coming on, and thank you also for, bringing up the indigenous I mean, like you said, stewardship of the land, which is a whole other topic that we could spend in fact, I would love to bring you back on specifically to talk about your work in and how that overlaps with, tribal and indigenous advocacy, but we've run out of time today, and folks, thank you for listening. As we've said, we'd love to have land back, and that's what we're going to do. But for today, what a great conversation. Thank you for explaining just high level what's going on. And yeah, definitely come back another time. Keep us updated because that's what we care about around here is public lands and people. So thank you, Land.
Lee, I totally enjoyed it, and I would just say that, like, I talked about social media, these minute and a half, 2 minutes. Like, we were on the phone for an hour or whatever on this, podcast for an hour, which is super rad because we got to talk about things, right? Like in a more detailed way. So thank you for that opportunity. Keep doing good stuff. It was great to meet you.
Right on. Alrighty, folks. We are just about done with another episode of Follow the Leader. I am your host, Lee. I was here with Land Tawney, the co-chair of American Hunters and Anglers. Folks, we have more on the way. We'll continue to interview outdoor folks. We just had Meg Carney, outdoor mentalist, who you'll appreciate this, Land. She works with outdoor companies to make sure that the products they're making for camping in the outdoors have very little that PFAS, and, like, she
Yeah,
looks at
yeah.
how gear is made so that the gear itself is not poisoning the environment. So, I mean, guys, there's so much we could talk about, but don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe, and to drop your comments. We'll get to them. Until then, see y'all next time. Bye-bye.
Right.